about this new role? I mean, you're going to have a bigger platform, a bigger voice. What do you want to do with it?
We talked in a previous video about the curse of being a narcissist. Specifically, we focused on the cycle of self-destruction, how they're unable to learn and therefore unable to improve, and so they're constantly stuck in the same cycle. There's another side effect that I would like to discuss today. Tunnel vision. Imagine you were a struggling wannabe influencer. You're a small fish in a very big pond. Competition is ruthless. It's sink or swim. And you are trying desperately to stay afloat. Now imagine you successfully caught the attention of one of the biggest fish in the ocean. Forget the pond, forget the sea. We're talking big league here. And it's not just any fish, it's a royal fish. One that was dubbed the most eligible bachelor fish of its generation. And by sheer dumb luck, with dumb being the operative word, he marries you. And virtually overnight, you are elevated from obscurity to the topmost echelons of society in the history of humankind. Finally, you've been put in a position of influence, of power. And you profess, with your latest royal ginger-haired accessory by your side, to want to use that power and influence for good.
Both of us have passions for wanting to make change for good.
To better humanity, to change the world.
That's what got date 2 in the books, probably.
And yet you decide, after a grand multi-million-dollar royal wedding that commanded the attention of billions worldwide, and after a very brief taste of the power and influence that automatically comes with your new position, you decide, you know what? This really isn't for me. Yeah, I think I want to go back to doing what I used to do before. Trying to compete in an oversaturated market to sell products and services to people and, meaningless shit. You see, people like Meghan Markle never see the bigger picture. And that's not because they don't want to, but it's really because they can't. They are cursed with a myopic worldview that renders them incapable of seeing anything beyond their own selfish needs and desires. And I say it's a curse because rather than recognize this glorious once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that was presented to her, becoming a royal, and all the power that comes with that, she had no interest in it. Every single time she talked about wanting to change the world and be a good influence, what she actually meant was, I want to be an influencer. She completely misunderstood that when you're royalty, you don't have to actively push your products for people to purchase. You are in a place of influence. Look at Catherine. It happens effortlessly. She wears, people buy. Which is what the actual definition of influence means. The act or power of producing an effect without apparent exertion of force or direct exercise of command. Catherine in a nutshell. Whereas influencers are a bit more forward about it and more salesperson rather than royal duchess. But I suppose the saying is true, especially when it comes to Meghan, water seeks its own level. Influence can take many forms. We just discussed the fashion element of it. Even before social media, before the internet, before electricity, when Marie Antoinette was alive and others of her kin, they too were trendsetters, because they were the it girls of their era. But that's fashion. And beyond helping a country's economy, I think I'd place it more at the shallow or frivolous end of influence. And that's certainly not the type of influence that Meghan Markle was talking about when she was giving her engagement interview and even the Spotify interview, giving a voice to the voiceless. I had no idea that Paris Hilton and Mariah Carey and Serena Williams were voiceless, but maybe that's just me. Point being, she talked about the more serious elements of influence, influencing positive change in the world, philanthropy, etc., etc. Earlier this year, I made a series about why Meghan Markle failed as a royal. And in this series, we discussed, amongst other things, of course, other commoners throughout history who married into royalty and who made the most of their positions. They understood that first, it wouldn't be easy, but most importantly, that it wasn't all about them. That they were simply a very fancy and, glamorous and famous cog in an elaborate machine known as a monarchy. They also understood that they could better the situation of not just their subjects and their country, but their family, which is really the antithesis of what Meghan Markle did and continues to do. Some of the women we discussed include Catherine I of Russia, not to be confused with Catherine the Great, Grace Kelly of Monaco, and Queen Maxima of the Netherlands. It's even worth mentioning Catherine, Princess of Wales, using her position to focus on the well-being of children, especially under the age of 5. We have William, who is trying to fight homelessness and trying to save the environment. We have Queen Consort Camilla, who has been fighting tirelessly for years to defeat domestic violence. All of these royals, whether historical or contemporary, understood the assignment, except for Meghan Markle. Speaking of Queen Consort Camilla, did you know that her great-grandmother, Alice Kepple, was mistress to Edward VII and perhaps one of the most influential royal mistresses in history? And when I say influential, I don't mean the Meghan Markle understanding of the term where you're selling clothing for a living, which, by the way, no hate or offense intended towards actual influencers. They need to do what they need to do to make their coin. But royalty is not about that. And it turns out neither were royal mistresses, because they too had a lot of power, a lot of influence that a lot of them have used to improve their own situation, of course, but also to improve the situation of their loved ones and to affect actual change in the course of history. I want to make it clear first that I am in no way comparing Meghan Markle to a royal mistress. Of course, Meghan is Harry's wife, she is married, and she is the Duchess of Sussex. But having said that, when you hear the term mistress today, your first thoughts might be affair, illicit, betrayal. But back in the day, being a royal mistress, especially to the reigning monarch or even the heir, was quite a coveted position. It was something that families would actively scheme for. They would push their young daughters to get in bed with the king. Quite often, in fact, these women were from aristocratic families themselves, whether through birth or more commonly by marriage. Yes, you heard me right. Married aristocratic women, noble women, would still be pushed into the line of vision of a monarch or an heir, because these families knew, including the husbands sometimes, that it would potentially elevate all of them. But the point of this is to show you how royal mistresses, who unlike Meghan Markle were not royalty, were smart enough to realize and utilize the immense power and influence that this admittedly precarious royal situation of theirs nonetheless gave them. And when listening to these stories, I want you to keep in mind how much more Meghan, as a married duchess, an actual senior royal at the time, and mother to a prince and princess in the line of succession, could have done with her position of immense privilege and influence. As I mentioned, Alice Kepple was Queen Camilla's great-grandmother. And fun fact, she was actually alive when Camilla was born. I believe she passed away when Camilla was only 4 months old. Not sure if she's ever met her, though. By the time she met Edward VII in 1898, she was already happily married to the Honorable George Kepple, and they remained so for 56 years, so basically for the rest of their lives. In fact, their marriage was so happy and loving that it's believed that George, who couldn't live without Alice, ended up dying a mere couple of months or so after she passed away from complications with her liver. I believe she had cirrhosis of the liver. And that proves that these affairs that women used to have with monarchs weren't usually seen as scandalous by society or even the husbands as long as they were discreet. That was the name of the game back then, discretion. And in fact, that's where Wallace and Edward really messed up, apart from also, I did a whole series about them. So if you want to go watch that, I'm not going to rehash things here. But basically, the government kind of wanted to get rid of Edward anyway, and they most likely used Wallace as an excuse. But Alice was still alive during the whole abdication scandal, and she had apparently said about it, "Things were done better in my day." Alice was described as humorous and charming, but with a shrewd intelligence and a keen grasp of British politics and economic events. So already she's got, a leg up or more, a few legs up on Meghan, who has honestly proven herself to be quite the opposite of all these things in the last few years. Now, they say that all of these qualities are what attracted Edward VII to Alice, but look, I'm more of a realist. She was 29, he was 57. You do the math. Now, that's not to say that her qualities didn't serve her well, because it's one thing to attract a Prince of Wales and future king, but it's another to keep him, because she remained his favorite, even though he was apparently a known philanderer, for the rest of his life. So from 1898 until his death in 1910. And I believe that's where her intellectual prowess and her charm came into play. She was so charming and discreet and just likable, unlike Meghan on all counts, that even the Queen Alexandra of Denmark, was in favor of the affair, and not only that, befriended and allied herself with Alice. So Alice was clever. She knew not to make enemies. Again, the exact opposite of what Meghan Markle chose to do. If you want to make sure you've got a good life in the royal family, perhaps you shouldn't be walking around telling people, "I'm going to be your boss one day." Now, Edward was absolutely besotted by Alice, and therefore she naturally had a profound level of influence over him. But rather than use it for her own selfish whims, she decided to be of use. For instance, the king and his ministers usually deferred to her and sought her advice when it came to political matters. Both she and her husband became very wealthy as a result of this affair. And in stark contrast to what Meghan chose to do to her family upon meeting Harry, Alice leveraged her position and her influence to elevate not only her own family, but also her in-laws. So you can see that Alice clearly played her cards right. She was only a mistress. She probably didn't even think that it would last anywhere near as long as it did. But she never squandered a moment. And she used her influence to not just keep the king happy, which any smart mistress would do, but she also benefited her country through her political acumen and, of course, her own family. All things which Meghan Markle absolutely failed to do. In fact, I would say she went out of her way not to do them. This next mistress might be more familiar to a few of you, especially those of you with an appreciation for fine art like I have. And she is Madame de Pompadour. This exquisite painting of hers is iconic. But I digress. If you thought Alice Kepple was impressive, and she was in her own right, Madame de Pompadour, born Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, was quite an artistic, literary, and political force in 18th century France, who counted the likes of Voltaire as a close friend. She was apparently raised to do this after some prophecy of her, stealing a king's heart, and her mother was like, "All right, that's what we're gonna do." And it paid off, because lo and behold, she met King Louis XV, and the rest was history. Like Alice, Jeanne was fiercely intelligent and charming. She knew how to make allies in court, which was very important. She too befriended the queen. In this instance, it was Queen Maria Carolina, eventually securing herself the much coveted position amongst the queen's ladies in waiting. Now, she was also married, by the way, before she met King Louis, to one Charles Guillaume Le Normand d'Étiole. I'm sorry, I really do try, because I do speak basic, well, I would say intermediate French. I did it in school, but my accent, when I don't use it, you lose it. Charles Guillaume Le Normand d'Étiole. The last one, d'Étiole, just sounds wrong. But unlike Alice, She obtained a legal separation from her husband when she became the king's mistress, after which she was created La Marquise du Pompadour. But the Marquise wasn't just in it for herself. With her power and influence at court, she managed to have her brother created the Marquis de Marigny and appointed to the position of the director of the king's buildings, which led to multiple collaborations between the three of them, including the École Militaire, the Place de la Concorde, and Le Petit Trianon at Versailles, which was Marie Antoinette's future place of refuge, for those of you who may not know. Jeanne was also a major patron of the arts, particularly porcelain, and she greatly influenced one of my favorite styles, if not my favorite styles of all time, the Rococo style. Politically, she was practically the prime minister. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, favors, promotions, and privileges could be obtained only through her good offices. I said that these royal mistresses were capable of changing the course of history. Jeanne, because of her political acumen, like Alice, was asked to intervene in negotiations which led to the Treaty of Versailles. That's really nothing to sneeze at. And this then led to the Franco-Austrian alliance. So Austria and France were mortal enemies until this happened, which also then led, you see how it's all, a ripple effect, to the union, the marriage between a young Marie Antoinette and the Dauphin of France, future King Louis XVI, which then led to the French Revolution. So when I say they affected the course of history, I meant every single word. Unfortunately for Jeanne, though, the alliance ultimately led to the 7 Years' War, which proved to be quite disastrous for France. They lost a lot of people, a lot of money, and the blame, probably predictably, was placed on Jeanne. She spent the rest of her life quite close to King Louis XV. He was actually there when she died at the very young age of 42. But she certainly didn't leave this world without leaving a significant mark upon it. Finally, we have perhaps the most colorful character in today's video, Virginia di Castellon, a minor Italian noble who was used as a pawn by her cousin, who was the prime minister of the then King Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia, later the King of Italy. Together with the king, they devised a plan to send young Virginia to Paris to meet with Napoleon III. So this is not Napoleon Bonaparte, to plead the case for the unification of Italy. Now, like the other two ladies, Virginia was also married to the Count de Castellon, and he traveled with her to France, incidentally. But her husband was so incensed that he filed for marital separation, which is kind of confusing because she also apparently had a brief affair with King Victor Emmanuel in 1855, which is the year she went to France, but that didn't seem to bother him. So, I don't know, to each their own. Didn't really faze Virginia though, because she wasn't exactly a wallflower. She was known to be flamboyant and decadent, causing a scene wherever she went, not necessarily through her antics, but more through her clothing, her elaborate fashions. I mean, at one point I read that she had covered her body in glue, basically rolled in it, before then rolling in feathers. So she was naked, but for these feathers, and attended a ball. So yeah, she was certainly no stranger to scandal, and she, looks like she courted it. Virginia remained in France for around a year as Napoleon's mistress before returning to Italy in 1857, when an attack against Napoleon, probably designed to discredit Virginia, because people didn't like that this Italian foreigner was in a position of power and influence, was foiled in her house. And so disgraced, she returned to Italy. However, all was not lost, for it appears that her year with Napoleon left quite an impression on him, because 4 years after her return to Italy, Italy was united as a kingdom, which is exactly what started this whole soap opera to begin with. I should say that it's not 100% confirmed that it was Virginia's influence that led to this, but given the influence that we know royal mistresses can have, it wouldn't be far-fetched to believe so. For those of you who are really into photography, I have a little fun fact for you about Virginia. She was a very early adopter of photography and was in fact seen as quite a pioneer in the field. She loved sitting for photographs so much that she directed Pierre-Louis Pierson, a French portrait photographer, to take 700 photographs of her over 4 decades, 40 years, capturing moments of her life for the camera. And that concludes our little trip back in history. As I said earlier, I selected these mistresses because I really wanted to show how much influence and power you can have simply by being, royal adjacent, simply by just having some type of a relationship with a royal, let alone actually being one. And all of these women understood that. And they were all so young as well. Meghan was 37 when she was a duchess, 36 when she was engaged, She was significantly older than these women and far more worldly and experienced than they were. And yet, her narcissism once again clouded her vision. Her preoccupation with herself led to her own demise. Because if she had understood the assignment, if she had stuck around, she wouldn't be a laughing stock like she is today. But more importantly, she would have done some good with her position. By now, years after their marriage, who knows what change, what positive change she could have effected. What a wasted opportunity. And that's all I have for you today. I hope you learned something. I hope you found it fascinating. And I'll see you next time. Ciao.